we are back with some coffee and climate conversation, and we are joined by Dr. Melissa Gervais, Associate Professor of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science here at Penn State. And this time we are talking tropical weather, and specifically tropical cyclones. In 2024, there were 5 hurricanes that caused over $1 billion in damage here in the United States. So let's talk about just what are the key ingredients needed to produce and sustain a hurricane.
Yeah, so in order to produce and sustain a hurricane, we need certain building blocks. So we need to have a disturbance. We need to be located just off the equator so we can have some rotation. And also we need to have very little change in wind speed from the surface to aloft. And then we need some fuel. So fuel can come in the form of warm sea surface temperatures, an unstable atmosphere, as well as high moisture content within the atmosphere.
Okay, and how do we classify the strength of hurricanes?
So we have the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is based on the wind speed. So we have our different categories from 1 to 5, and category 3 and higher would be considered a major hurricane. And this is all just based on wind speed.
Okay, and so what are the main hazards that are associated with hurricanes?
Well, so there's strong winds and the impact that those have, down trees, et cetera. There's also storm surge, which is really important, especially on the coast, as well as waves and rip currents. Tornadoes can be induced by these, as well as inland flooding is actually a really important impact.
Well, that's a really important one for here in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
So it's interesting that we measure the strength using wind, but the impacts are much more far-reaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's important that we, even though we're measuring wind, and we continue to think about the additional impacts. So I think a really good example was Hurricane Helene in 2024. So this had a huge impact, on the coastal communities in Florida with storm surge. But it also, I think a lot of us think about this event in terms of the inland flooding. So there were over 176 deaths associated directly with Hurricane Helene, of which at least 95 were associated with freshwater flooding in the interior. And so we do have to consider that, especially as people in Pennsylvania. I think sometimes we think of hurricanes as being kind of far away, but the impact on flooding can actually be really important.
In a previous segment, we talked about extreme precipitation events and how there is a relationship that can be associated with this, and that the fact that the atmosphere can hold 4% more water vapor for every 1 degree Fahrenheit in increase in temperature. So does this hold true in hurricanes as well?
Yes, it does. And so we can see that there will be, and there is, more rainfall associated with hurricanes now and in the future. So as an example, the World Weather Attribution did a study on Hurricane Helene and found that there was a 10% increase in the rainfall associated with Helene as a result of climate change. That's already occurred.
Wow. So what about storm surge?
Yeah, so storm surge also is a very kind of slam dunk impact of climate change. So as we increase the ocean temperature, the ocean expands, and so that increases the sea level. Also, we're melting glaciers and ice caps, and so that adds more water to the oceans, that increases that sea level. As we increase that sea level, when we do have storm surge, that leads to even more increase in storm surge. And so, if we remember Hurricane Sandy, we know how important storm surge is and how devastating it can be.
Mm-hmm. So what other impacts does climate change have on hurricanes?
So it's likely that the tracks have shifted a little bit poleward or northward for us here in the United States. Wind speeds are increasing. The proportion of those major hurricanes, the proportion of categories, especially 4 and 5. There's also, that increase in the hourly precipitation rate and a slowing of the propagation or the movement of the storms. So think about like a Hurricane Harvey when you think about how critical that is, right? A storm that kind of parks and has a lot of rainfall associated with it is really devastating.
Mm-hmm. So are there any other factors that impact the destruction that comes with tropical cyclones in the United States?
Mm-hmm. So the destruction is not just a factor of the the actual weather itself. It's also about how vulnerable we are. So if we have more people moving to the coast and building along coastlines, that creates kind of an expanding bullseye that these storms can hit and leads to more damages. Now, I personally do enjoy a coastal vacation, but those homes are really under threat. And so we do have to think about where we're building and how resilient we are.
So bringing it home to our audience here in Pennsylvania, what can we do to prepare during hurricane season?
Well, so I think one thing we always need to keep in mind is that the impacts are not just at the coastline. So especially for those of us in Pennsylvania who are further away from the coast, know that a storm can still have devastating impacts for you and your family. And so it is important to stay abreast of the latest developments, listen to your state and local officials, as well as those who are providing weather information to help keep yourself safe.
So you're telling us to keep watching Weather World for more of that weather information. All right, well, Dr. Marisa Gervais, Associate Professor of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science here at Penn State, thank you so much. And you'll be back again in the future for another coffee and climate conversation. And we'll be back in a moment with more.